2 days. That's all it took to completely change the lifeless corner of my garden. I poured 1 gallon of a simple homemade mixture onto the hardest, most compacted patch of soil I owned. The ground was so dense I could barely push a trowel into it. Just 48 hours later, I lifted the mulch, and I couldn't believe what I saw. 31 earthworms were crawling through a single square foot of soil. The week before? Not one. Healthy soil doesn't appear by accident. Earthworms only stay where the soil is alive. So what changed so fast? The answer surprised me. I found a forgotten soil recipe mentioned in an old USDA publication from the late 1940s. Back then, gardeners focused on feeding the soil first, not just the plants. Over the decades, that simple approach faded as commercial fertilizers became the norm. Today, almost nobody talks about this inexpensive mixture anymore. It costs less than $2 to make. Uses ingredients that are probably already in your kitchen, and by the end of this video, you'll know exactly why it can help transform tired, compacted soil into a place where worms and healthy plants want to live. Let's make it. Before I show you the recipe, stay with me until the end. Because one common pantry ingredient changes everything, and leaving it out is the biggest mistake almost every gardener makes. I didn't discover this recipe on social media. I found it while digging through old gardening publications and agricultural references from the 1940s. One document caught my attention. It described a simple homemade soil drench designed to help restore biological activity in compacted garden soil using ingredients almost anyone could afford. The formula was surprisingly simple, so I kept digging. I searched through newer gardening guides expecting to find the same recommendation, but it was rarely mentioned again. That made me wonder, was it forgotten because it stopped working, or because newer products gradually replaced these older techniques? There was only one way to find out. I mixed the recipe exactly as described. I poured it onto the hardest, most lifeless section of my garden. Then I waited. What happened over the next 48 hours completely changed the way I think about healthy soil. And in just a moment, I'll show you the exact ingredient that made the biggest difference. I kept searching. 1952. Nothing. 1956. Still nothing. 1960. The recipe was gone. I checked gardening guides from the next 2 decades. Nothing, no update, no revised version. It simply stopped appearing. That caught my attention. The late 1940s and early 1950s were a turning point in agriculture. New commercial fertilizers became widely available, and gardening advice began to focus more on feeding plants directly than on rebuilding the biology of the soil itself. Whether those changes are connected or not, one thing is clear. Many of these older, low-cost soil-building methods quietly faded from mainstream gardening advice. But here's why that matters today. If your soil is hard, if water runs off instead of soaking in, if worms seem impossible to find, then the real problem may not be your plants at all. It may be that your soil has stopped supporting life. The recipe I'm about to show you was designed to change exactly that. And one simple ingredient is responsible for most of the results. Now think about what that really means. In heavy clay soil like mine, building a thriving earthworm population usually takes years of adding compost, mulch, and organic matter. I know, because that's exactly what I did. Season after season, slowly improving the soil one layer at a time. Then I tested this simple homemade drench. Less than 2 days later, I lifted the mulch, and the difference was impossible to ignore. The soil felt softer, moisture stayed where it belonged, and earthworms had begun returning to an area that had looked completely lifeless. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just feeding plants. It was helping feed the living ecosystem beneath them. And the best part? Every ingredient is inexpensive, easy to find, and probably already sitting somewhere in your kitchen. So let me show you exactly how I make it. Start with 1 gallon of clean water. Now, pay close attention. This first step is the one almost everyone gets wrong. If you miss it, the entire mixture becomes far less effective. Start with 1 gallon of water. Whenever possible, use rainwater or water that has been left sitting for about 24 hours, so much of the chlorine can dissipate. Chlorinated water isn't always a problem, but reducing chlorine may help protect the beneficial microorganisms you're trying to encourage. Now add 2 tablespoons of unsulfured blackstrap molasses. This isn't just a sweetener. Molasses provides simple sugars and trace minerals that help feed beneficial soil microbes as they begin multiplying. Next, add 1/4 cup of plain yellow cornmeal. Most people assume it's there to fertilize the plants. It isn't. Cornmeal serves as an organic food source for many soil microorganisms, helping support the underground ecosystem that healthy gardens depend on. Already, this mixture is doing something most commercial fertilizers never try to do. It's not just feeding the plant, it's helping rebuild the life inside the soil. And we're still missing the single ingredient that makes this recipe truly different. Now for the ingredient almost every copy of this recipe leaves out. And according to the notes I found, it may be the most important part of the entire mixture. Add 1 tablespoon of non-fat dry milk. Nothing fancy. Just the inexpensive powdered milk you can find in almost any grocery store. At first, it seems completely out of place. Why would anyone pour milk into garden soil? Don't worry. I'll explain exactly what it's doing before the end of this video, because this simple ingredient surprises almost everyone. Now stir everything until the molasses has completely dissolved and the mixture looks smooth. That's it. No expensive fertilizers, no secret chemicals. Just 4 inexpensive ingredients working together to support the living biology inside your soil. The entire gallon usually costs well under $1 to make, depending on local prices. But here's where almost everyone makes their biggest mistake. The recipe isn't what determines the results. The application does. Pour it at the wrong time, or in the wrong place, and you can dramatically reduce its effectiveness. So before you mix a single gallon, let me show you exactly how to apply it the right way. Now for the ingredient almost every copy of this recipe leaves out. And according to the notes I found, it may be the most important part of the entire mixture. Add 1 tablespoon of non-fat dry milk. Nothing fancy. Just the inexpensive powdered milk you can find in almost any grocery store. At first, it seems completely out of place. Why would anyone pour milk into garden soil? Don't worry. I'll explain exactly what it's doing before the end of this video, because this simple ingredient surprises almost everyone. Now stir everything until the molasses has completely dissolved and the mixture looks smooth. That's it. No expensive fertilizers, no secret chemicals. Just 4 inexpensive ingredients working together to support the living biology inside your soil. The entire gallon usually costs well under $1 to make, depending on local prices. But here's where almost everyone makes their biggest mistake. The recipe isn't what determines the results. The application does. Pour it at the wrong time, or in the wrong place, and you can dramatically reduce its effectiveness. So before you mix a single gallon, let me show you exactly how to apply it the right way. Now comes the part that determines whether this works or not. Don't dump the entire gallon in one spot. Pour it slowly over about 1 square yard of soil. Give the liquid time to soak in. If it runs across the surface, you're wasting most of the mixture. As soon as you've finished, cover the area with mulch again. That step isn't just recommended, it's essential. In a few minutes, I'll explain exactly why that layer of mulch makes such a difference. Then leave the soil alone. Don't water over it. Don't dig it up. Give the underground biology time to respond. I always wait 48 hours before checking. Then I carefully pull back the mulch, kneel down, and look closely at the soil surface. What you notice first isn't usually the plants. It's the sudden burst of life underneath them. Tiny tunnels, fresh worm castings, and if conditions are right, far more earthworm activity than before. That's the moment everything starts to make sense. And it's also why older soil building methods still deserve attention today, even if they're mentioned less often than modern fertilizer programs. Now here's the part almost nobody explains. The recipe itself isn't the real secret. The biology behind it is. At first I assumed the mixture was feeding the worms directly. But that isn't what's happening. Earthworms aren't attracted to molasses. They don't crawl across the garden looking for cornmeal. So why would this mixture bring more earthworm activity? The answer is hidden beneath the surface. The ingredients don't feed the worms first. They help feed the microscopic life already living in the soil. As bacteria and fungi become more active, they begin breaking down organic material faster. That creates a healthier underground food web, and earthworms naturally move toward places where that food web is thriving. In other words, you're not trying to attract worms with a snack. You're creating the kind of living soil where worms already want to be. Once I understood that, the entire recipe finally made sense. And it also explained why one small ingredient, the one almost everyone skips, can make such an important difference. This is the moment everything clicked for me. The mixture isn't feeding earthworms directly. It's feeding the microscopic life that earthworms depend on. Think of healthy soil as a city you can't see. Billions of bacteria and fungi are constantly breaking down organic matter. Earthworms naturally thrive where that underground community is active, because that's where their food is found. Now the ingredients start to make sense. The molasses provides an easy-to-use energy source that can help stimulate microbial activity. The cornmeal works differently. It breaks down more gradually, providing a longer-lasting food source as soil organisms continue decomposing it. Together, they don't just feed the plants. They help support the living ecosystem beneath them. And that's the key. You're not trying to lure worms into your garden. You're creating conditions that make healthy soil more inviting for the organisms that already belong there. But one ingredient is still missing from the explanation: the powdered milk. At first I thought it was the strangest part of the recipe. Then I discovered why older gardeners believed it belonged there. Here's where the second ingredient becomes so important. The molasses gives soil microbes a quick burst of easily available energy. The cornmeal breaks down more slowly, helping provide food over a longer period as soil organisms continue decomposing it. Instead of one short spike in activity, the soil can stay biologically active for longer. That gives earthworms more time to respond. Think of it this way. You're not feeding the worms. You're setting the table. And once the table is ready, the underground life begins to respond. But don't take my word for it. Test it yourself. Choose the poorest section of your garden, the place where the soil is hard, lifeless, and nothing seems to thrive. Before you apply the mixture, lift back the mulch and take a close look. Count what you find. Maybe it's no earthworms. Maybe it's only one or two. Either way, make a note of it. Then apply the drench exactly as I showed you. Cover the soil with mulch again. Leave it undisturbed, and come back about 48 hours later. Don't just look at the surface. Pull the mulch back slowly. Look for fresh worm castings, tiny tunnels, increased moisture, and any signs that the soil is becoming more biologically active. That's a much better comparison than simply trusting anyone else's numbers, including mine. Healthy gardens are built by observing what happens in your own soil, and that's exactly why this simple test is so powerful. So I decided to compare it properly. Not by guessing, not by looking at one patch of soil. I marked out 3 identical test plots in the hardest part of the garden. The first plot was left completely untouched. The second received only the same amount of dechlorinated water. The third received the full soil drench. Everything else stayed the same. The same soil, the same mulch, the same weather, the same waiting period. 48 hours later, I came back and checked each plot one by one. The untreated area looked almost exactly as before. The water-only plot showed very little difference, but the plot treated with the drench showed noticeably more signs of biological activity, including increased earthworm activity, compared with the other 2 plots. That was the moment I realized this mixture wasn't simply adding nutrients. It was helping create better conditions for life beneath the surface. Of course, every garden is different. Your soil type, moisture, temperature, and existing biology will all affect the results. That's why I always encourage people to run a small side-by-side test in their own garden before treating a larger area. When you compare identical plots, you learn far more than by relying on anyone else's experience. And there's still one part of the recipe we haven't explained: the powdered milk. At first, it looked like the strangest ingredient of all. Then I discovered why many experienced gardeners refuse to leave it out. Before you try this, there's something almost nobody tells you. The recipe is only half the story. What really determines the results are the conditions. Miss one of these, and you may see little or even no noticeable effect. The first condition is soil temperature. This method works best when the soil has warmed up and microbial activity is already increasing. In cool soil, bacteria and other microorganisms become much less active. That means the underground food web develops more slowly, and earthworms have less reason to move into the area. That's why timing matters just as much as the ingredients. Many gardeners focus on what they add to the soil. Experienced gardeners also pay attention to when they add it. And temperature is only the first of 4 conditions. The second one is even more important. And it's the mistake I see gardeners make most often. The second condition is the one most gardeners never think about: the water. Before I mix anything, I always check one simple thing first. Is the soil warm enough? If the ground is still cold, I wait. Healthy soil biology responds much more slowly in cool conditions, so patience usually gives better results than rushing. Now let's talk about the water. Whenever possible, I use rainwater or water that's been left standing long enough for much of the chlorine to dissipate. Why? Because the goal isn't just to water the soil. It's to encourage the living microorganisms already there. Chlorinated tap water won't automatically ruin your results, but reducing chlorine exposure may help create better conditions for beneficial microbes. If your local water supply uses chloramine instead of chlorine, letting the water sit alone usually won't remove it. That's why many experienced gardeners prefer rainwater whenever they have it available. It sounds like a small detail, but healthy gardens are often built by getting the small details right. And we're only halfway through the 4 conditions. The third one is the easiest to overlook, and it can make the biggest difference of all: The third condition is surprisingly easy to get wrong. The proportions matter. It can be tempting to think that adding more molasses will produce even better results. In reality, more isn't always better. The goal is to provide enough readily available food for soil microbes without throwing the mixture out of balance. That's why I stick to the same measurements every time. 2 tablespoons of unsulfured blackstrap molasses, 1/4 cup of plain yellow cornmeal, mixed into 1 gallon of water. Simple, consistent, repeatable. The same idea applies to the water itself. Whenever possible, I use rainwater or water that's been left standing so much of the chlorine can dissipate. That doesn't guarantee better results, but it may create more favorable conditions for the beneficial microorganisms you're trying to support. Healthy soil is all about balance. Small changes can influence how quickly microbial communities respond. Now for the fourth, and arguably the most overlooked, condition. Mulch. Without it, you're giving away much of the advantage. Here's why. The top layer of soil can warm up and dry out surprisingly quickly, especially on sunny or windy days. Beneficial soil organisms perform best when moisture and temperature stay relatively stable. That's exactly what a layer of mulch helps provide. After applying the drench, cover the area with about 2 inches of organic mulch. Wood chips, straw, shredded leaves, whatever you normally use in your garden. The goal isn't the material itself, it's protecting the living environment beneath it. Think of mulch as a blanket for the soil. It slows moisture loss, reduces temperature swings, and creates conditions where soil life can keep working. Without that protective layer, the mixture may not perform as well because the surface dries out much faster. That's why I never judge the recipe by itself. I judge the entire system. Warm soil, the right proportions, water that supports soil biology, and a protective layer of mulch. Miss any one of those and you may not see the same results. Get all 4 working together, and the real transformation begins. But there's still one final piece we've been building toward since the beginning of this video. The ingredient almost everyone leaves out. And once you understand why it's there, the entire recipe finally makes sense. And that's what fascinated me the most. The recipe itself isn't complicated. The real value is understanding when to use it, how to use it, and why each step matters. Those details rarely fit into a short set of instructions or a product label. They're the kind of practical knowledge that often gets passed from one gardener to another. Over the years, gardening advice has naturally evolved as new products, new research, and new growing methods have appeared. But somewhere along the way, many of these step-by-step biological approaches became far less common in everyday gardening conversations. As someone who enjoys both science and gardening, I find that fascinating. Because once you understand the biology, the recipe stops feeling like a gardening trick. It starts making scientific sense. And that brings us back to the one ingredient we've been teasing since the beginning: the powdered milk. At first glance, it seems completely out of place. But once you understand its role, you'll never look at this recipe the same way again. Before we continue, I want to mention something that many of you have been asking for. If you're enjoying this style of gardening, where every recommendation is explained with the science behind it, instead of just telling you what to do, I've put everything into one complete guide. Inside, you'll find the exact soil building process I use, how to diagnose common soil problems, simple tests you can perform at home, and step-by-step methods for growing healthier vegetables without wasting money on products you don't need. It's designed for gardeners who want to understand why something works, not just copy a recipe. If you'd like to take a closer look, you'll find the link in the description below. No pressure at all. Now, Let's get back to the most interesting part of this story, because understanding why these methods work is far more valuable than simply memorizing the recipe. As I dug deeper into the history, one thing became impossible to ignore. The years immediately after World War II marked a major turning point in agriculture. Factories that had supported the war effort were adapted to produce large quantities of nitrogen fertilizer for farming. At the same time, agricultural research was advancing rapidly. New fertilizers, new crop varieties, new farming practices, and new recommendations for growers. None of that is controversial. It's simply part of how modern agriculture evolved. What fascinated me wasn't that these changes happened. It was that the conversation gradually shifted. More attention was placed on feeding crops directly, while many older soil-building practices became less common in everyday gardening advice. That doesn't mean the old methods stopped working, and it doesn't mean modern fertilizers are bad. It simply means they solve different problems. One approach focuses on supplying nutrients to the plant. The other begins by supporting the biology of the soil itself. The best gardeners understand both, and once I realized that, the old recipe made much more sense. Because it was never really designed to feed plants. It was designed to help rebuild the living ecosystem underneath them. As agriculture modernized through the 1950s and 1960s, the way people talked about soil changed. Extension services, universities, and researchers increasingly focused on recommendations that were easier to measure, standardize, and reproduce across millions of acres. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, application rates, yield data. Those advances helped farmers dramatically increase production. But at the same time, many traditional soil-building practices received far less attention in mainstream gardening advice. That doesn't mean those methods were proven wrong. And it doesn't mean modern fertilizers are the enemy. They simply address different parts of the same system. One approach supplies nutrients directly to the crop. The other focuses on building the living ecosystem that supports those crops over time. The most successful gardeners rarely choose one or the other. They understand how to use both. And that's the lesson I took away from this old recipe. It wasn't a replacement for good gardening practices. It was a reminder that healthy soil is more than just NPK numbers on a fertilizer bag. It's a living ecosystem. And once you start treating it that way, everything above the surface begins to make a lot more sense. Now, I want to be fair. Modern fertilizers changed agriculture for a reason. When you're growing hundreds or thousands of acres, standardized nutrient recommendations can dramatically increase production and make crop management far more predictable. That's a real achievement. But home gardens aren't thousands of acres. A backyard garden gives you something commercial agriculture rarely has: the ability to observe every square foot, to experiment, to improve the soil over time instead of focusing only on this season's crop. That's what changed the way I garden. For years, I believed success came from buying the right bag and following the label. Eventually, I realized something important. Healthy plants begin with healthy soil, and healthy soil begins with the living organisms beneath the surface. That doesn't mean fertilizers are useless. It means fertilizers are only one piece of a much larger system. The older gardening methods reminded people to build that system first. Whether those ideas became less common because research priorities changed, new products became available, or gardening advice simply evolved over time, one lesson remains just as valuable today. When you take care of the soil starts taking care of the plants. And that's the biggest lesson this simple recipe taught me. Now for the ingredient we've been building towards since the beginning. The one almost everyone leaves out: powdered milk. At first, I thought it sounded completely out of place. Why would anyone add milk to garden soil? Then I looked at what it actually contains. Powdered milk provides natural sugars, proteins, minerals, and calcium. As it breaks down, those compounds can become another food source for the diverse community of microorganisms already living in the soil. Instead of relying on a single ingredient, the recipe combines several different organic food sources that decompose at different rates. Molasses provides a quick source of energy, cornmeal breaks down more gradually, and powdered milk adds additional nutrients and organic compounds that help support the soil ecosystem as decomposition continues. No single ingredient performs the magic, so now the entire recipe comes together. Molasses provides a quick source of energy. Cornmeal breaks down more gradually, helping sustain microbial activity over time. And powdered milk adds proteins, minerals, and other organic compounds that become part of the ongoing decomposition process. No single ingredient is doing all the work. Each one plays a different role. Together, they help create conditions that support a more active soil ecosystem. And that's the real secret. You're not trying to feed earthworms directly. You're helping create the kind of environment where earthworms naturally want to stay. When I compared different versions of the mixture, the complete recipe consistently produced more visible signs of biological activity than versions with ingredients left out. That doesn't guarantee identical results in every garden. Soil type, moisture, temperature, and that's exactly why this ingredient is so often overlooked. Powdered milk doesn't look like something you'd add to garden soil. It looks like something you'd stir into a cup of coffee. So when people copied and simplified old recipes over the years, it was often the first ingredient to disappear. Not because it had been proven unnecessary, but because it seemed out of place. The irony is that healthy soil doesn't care what an ingredient looks like. It only responds to what that ingredient contributes. Powdered milk adds proteins, minerals, and organic compounds that become part of the soil's natural decomposition process. On its own, it's not a miracle. But combined with the molasses, the cornmeal, the right moisture, warm soil, and a layer of mulch, it helps complete the system. That's the lesson I wish I had learned years earlier. For the longest time, I believed the answer was finding a better fertilizer. Now I spend just as much time thinking about the life beneath the surface as I do about the plants above it. Because once the soil ecosystem becomes healthier, the garden often follows. And in my experience, before you go, you now have the complete recipe. You know why each ingredient is there. And more importantly, you know the 4 conditions that determine whether it has the best chance of working. But here's one final thought. The biggest mistake gardeners make isn't using the wrong fertilizer. It's never measuring what actually changed. If you don't record where your soil started, you'll never know whether your next change made a real difference. That's why I put together my complete gardening guide. It walks you through a simple system for observing your soil, tracking improvements over time, and making decisions based on what you actually see in your own garden, not guesswork. Inside, you'll find printable record sheets, soil observation guides, and step-by-step methods for building healthier soil season after season. If that sounds useful, you'll find the link in the description below. And whether you download it or not, I hope you try one thing this week. Pick the worst corner of your garden. Test it. Observe it. Write down what you find. Because the best gardeners don't just grow better plants. They learn to understand the soil beneath them. I'll see you in the next video.